Committee will come to order. Would the witness please rise and hold up his right hand? Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give to this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do, sir.
Would you be seated, please, sir? It's my intention to continue with just the preliminary phase of this examination through counsel, and then if the chairman and other members of the committee have not yet returned, to recess briefly while we await their return, and not incidentally while I try to go make this vote. Would you, Mr. Hamilton, go ahead and start with the preliminary questions, please?
General Cushman, would you state your full name, please?
Robert E. Cushman, Jr.
And what is your address?
My address is Marine Corps Headquarters, Washington, D.C.
And your home address, General Cushman?
The Commandant's Quarters, 8th and I, Southeast.
And your current position with the Marine Corps is Commandant, is that correct?
Sir.
When did you become Commandant?
1 January 1972.
Before that date, General Cushman, were you the Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency?
Yes, sir, I was.
And what was your tenure at that position?
I was there almost 3 years.
Do you have the date, sir?
I don't have the date of taking office exactly. I think it was about April 15th when I moved into the Deputy Director's chair, 15 April 1969.
I believe you told us at a staff interview your tenure there was from May 7, 1969 to December 31, 1971. Does that sound correct to you?
Because that was when I had the figures with me.
Did there come a time on or about July 7, 1971, when you received a call from the White House requesting CIA assistance in regard to a White House project?
Yes, sir. I received a call on the 7th of July, 1971, from Mr. Ehrlichman, who said that Howard Hunt had been hired as a consultant to the White House on security matters, that he would be coming to see me, and could I lend him a hand, or words to that effect.
Excuse me, I think now we're beyond the preliminary questioning and beginning to get into the substantive part of the testimony. The other members of the committee have not yet returned, and I know General Cushman's testimony is very important and relevant. So the committee will stand in recess for a few moments until we have the return of our other members.
The committee had some logistical problems keeping a member in the committee so the proceedings would be official. But after a short pause, Assistant Chief Counsel James Hamilton was able to continue his interrogation of General Cushman.
General Cushman, now that other members of the committee have returned, I'd like to ask you the same question I asked you before we had that brief intermission. Did there come a time around July 7, 1971, when you received a call from the White House requesting CIA assistance in a White House project?
Yes, sir. On the 7th of July, 1971, I received a call from Mr. Ehrlichman, who stated, as best I can remember the words, that Howard Hunt had been hired as a consultant to the White House on security matters, that he would be coming to pay me a visit, and could I lend him a hand.
Now, did you consider that this request from Mr. Ehrlichman to be a usual request, a commonplace request?
This was the only such request that I can recall by Mr. Ehrlichman. I used to get calls frequently, of course, from other people saying that someone would come to call on me. Usually they were looking for a job, that sort of thing.
But I take it that from the White House, with the exception of calls from the National Security Council, that this is the only call that you have had. Is that correct?
As far as I can recall, yes.
So would it be fair to characterize it, as you did in one of the staff interviews, as an extraordinary request?
Well, Since all he said was that Howard Hunt would be coming to call, I don't regard it as extraordinary. It was unusual.
And did you agree to see Mr. Hunt?
I did.
And why did you do that, sir?
Well, I had no reason to refuse that I could think of. As I say, I'd been seeing people regularly, off and on, in that position, who were looking for jobs or in some cases wanting to sell something to the agency, that sort of thing.
General Cushman, did you ask Mr. Ehrlichman to give you sufficient facts to enable you to ascertain whether the request that he made came within the CIA's statutory jurisdiction and would not involve it in the internal security area or in domestic police or law enforcement matters?
No, sir, since his request was simply that he was coming to call and would I see him. In my mind, he simply established the bona fides of Mr. Hunt as being employed by the White House. The White House, of course, in the form of the National Security Council, is the boss of the CIA.
And did you subsequently meet with Mr. Hunt in your office on July 22, 1971?
Yes, sir, I did.
And was the conversation of that meeting taped?
Yes, sir.
Why did you tape this conversation?
I taped it so that I would have a recollection of it, since Mr. Hunt did not want anyone else in the room. When he arrived, he asked that it just be the two of us. Consequently, I recorded the conversation so I wouldn't have to take notes.
Did Mr. Hunt know that he was being taped?
No, sir, I didn't tell him.
And was taping a conversation a common practice on your part?
No, sir, I probably taped about half a dozen over 3 years.
General Cushman, the Central Intelligence Agency has provided us with a partial transcript of this meeting. And I would like to show you now a document entitled Meeting Between the DDC-1, General Cushman, and Howard Hunt, 22 July 1971.
Yes, sir, that's DDCI, which is Deputy Director of Central Intelligence.
Hate to interrupt, but there's another vote on in the Senate, and so we'll have to suspend since Senator Talbot himself will have to go and vote.
As the committee completes another roll call vote, we're going to take a short break. Public television's coverage of the Senate Watergate hearings will continue after a pause for station identification.
Unabridged coverage of these hearings is provided as a public service by the member stations of PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service. From Washington, NPACT continues its coverage of hearings by the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. Here again, correspondent Jim Lehrer.
As we go back to the committee proceedings, the former Deputy Director of the CIA, General Robert Cushman, is at the witness table.
Would the committee come to order? The chairman has indicated he wishes us to proceed while he answers this roll call vote. Would counsel proceed with the interrogation?
Now, General Cushman, I have just shown you a document entitled Meeting Between the DDC-1, General Cushman, and Howard Hunt, 22 July 1971. Are you familiar with this document?
Yes, sir. I might interject here that that's DDCI, which stands for Deputy Director Central Intelligence, rather than one.
Thank you, General. Now, is this transcript that I have given you an accurate partial recording of the meeting between you and Mr. Hunt on that date?
I think it is, yes, sir.
Mr. Vice Chairman, I'd like for this to be inserted into the record.
If there's no objection, it'll be received and identified as an exhibit to the record.
Now, referring you to page 3 of the transcript, General, does it show that you affirmed to Mr. Hunt on that date that Mr. Ehrlichman had called you regarding assistance to Mr. Hunt?
Well, it seems to, in that Mr. Hunt used the word Ehrlichman in starting a sentence. And I said, yes, he called me.
And did you make a similar statement that it was Mr. Ehrlichman who had called you in a July 8, 1971 meeting between senior agency officials that is recorded in the official minutes of that meeting?
Yes, sir, I did.
Now, would you please tell the committee the nature of Mr. Hunt's request to you and the reasons he expressed for needing assistance?
Yes, sir. He started right out in the conversation as soon as he got in the office, saying that he'd been charged with a highly sensitive mission by the White House, which involved an interview of a person whose ideology he was not certain of, and that he felt that he had to disguise himself to conduct this interview, and requested that the agency provide him with the materials to establish that alias and to mask his appearance or change it so that he would not be identifiable to the person he was interviewing.
General Cushman, did you ask Mr. Hunt to give you sufficient facts so you could ascertain whether the CIA assistant's involvement in this matter would be permissible under its statutory jurisdiction?
No, because I considered that a one-time interview, as he stated it, was perfectly okay.
What aid and assistance did you initially provide Mr. Hunt?
I asked my executive assistant, Mr. Wagner, to arrange with the technical services people in the agency to meet with Mr. Hunt and to provide him with what was necessary.
And what was the assistance they gave him, the specific assistance?
Well, I found out later that they gave him a driver's license, I believe a Social Security card, some things to carry around in his pocket that would back up the name on the driver's license. They gave him, I believe, a wig and a speech altering device.
Did Mr. Hunt make any request to you as to how these items should be delivered?
He said that he did not want to come back into the agency, and could they be delivered to him at a house, safe house as it's called, somewhere off the premises of CIA.
And did you agree to this?
Yes, sir, I did.
And did you subsequently report your actions to Mr. Helms, who was then the director of the CIA?
I discussed it with him, to the best of my recollection, a couple of days later. As I recall, on the 7th of July, I was the acting director. Mr. Helms was not present. And therefore, on the 8th is when I announced at the staff meeting about the phone call. Then after Mr. Hunt did appear on the 22nd of July, it's the best of my recollection that I did so report to the director, probably along with a lot of other things that we talked about frequently. And whether he remembers this, I don't know. The last time I talked to him, he said he didn't recall as to whether I had talked to him or not. I think I did.
Is it your recollection, General, that he indicated his approval of the actions you had taken?
Yes.
Did there come a time around the 18th of August, 1971, when Mr. Hunt began to make additional demands on the agency?
Yes, sir. On the 18th of July, 1971, he conveyed to me, not directly, I never did talk directly with Mr. Hunt after the interview, as far as I recall, but he relayed through my executive assistant that he wanted the services of a stenographer whom he knew, and we turned that down. I discussed it with Mr. Helms, and we both agreed it was not a proper request.
Was it reported to you that these new requests that Mr. Hunt was making was in conjunction with what he described as a new assignment that he'd been given by the White House?
I can't recall that exactly. I thought so. but I'm not sure. I do know that I thought at the time that since he was a paid consultant, that he should be hiring a stenographer if he needed one, and that he was probably trying to lighten the expenses of his job, so to speak, by borrowing whatever he could from us. And that this was not something that we could do.
Would you outline for the committee the other requests that Mr. Hunt made of the agency beside the request for a secretary? And would
Yes,
you also indicate, while doing this, General Cushman, which requests the agency granted and which ones were turned down?
Yes. As I say, I regarded the secretary thing as something entirely separate, and that he was trying to save the expenses of hiring a stenographer. And that request did get relayed to me promptly, along about the 18th of August. However, the other requests I didn't really find out about until they were cumulative, and the technical services people began to worry about these requests, and they called my office to see whether the instructions still stood to help Hunt out. I found that he had been given a tape recorder and that he had been issued a camera. I found out that the camera had been used to expose some film, and that we had developed it and delivered the prints, I think it was, to him. I found out that he'd brought in another man, whom I find out in 1973 was probably Liddy. He'd brought in another man and talked the technical services people into giving that man an alias and some false papers. So all in all, it struck me that he was exceeding what he had told me he was going to do, namely a one-time interview, and that he was going to do this himself. So we discussed it, Mr. Helms and I, and decided to turn it off.
And just for the record, the recorder was contained in a typewriter case, is that correct?
I believe so. I never have seen any of the equipment until this year. I never really saw a list of what had been issued.
And the camera was the type of camera that could be disguised in a tobacco pouch?
That's what I understand.
General, do you know what any of the equipment that Mr. Hunt obtained was used for?
I think he kept it. I believe the technical services people asked for its return, but it was not returned, with the exception, I've been told, of the camera, I believe it was, as being not suited to whatever it was he wanted to use it for.
Well, do you know what it was actually used for?
No, I have no idea.
Now, did Mr. Hunt also request that he be given a New York address and phone services in New York?
Yes, sir. And this was when we decided that these requests were clearly escalating into improper requests, in that they would involve CIA people. He wanted an office, and he wanted the telephone to be monitored as an answering service would when he wasn't there. And this, so to speak, was just too much, and I called up Mr. Ehrlichman and told him we couldn't accede to these type of requests, that I thought Mr. Hunt, was not exercising proper judgment, and that therefore I passed the word on.
And what was Mr. Ehrlichman's comment at that time?
He said, okay, which I took to mean that we didn't have to accede to Hunt's requests, and said that he'd restrain Mr. Hunt.
Was this action taken on your own part or at the instruction of Mr. Helms?
We talked it over, and I made the phone call. It was on his instructions.
Now, after that date on which you called Mr. Ehrlichman, which I believe you said was August 27th, 1971, is that correct?
27th of August, 1971.
Yes. Did Mr. Hunt make another request of the agency?
I don't have any knowledge of it firsthand. I've been told that he asked for a credit card and that this was turned down.
And is it your information that he asked for that credit card on the 31st of August?
Yes, that's what I understand.
General Cushman, when did you first learn of the break-in of Dr. Ellsberg's psychiatrist office?
I think it was when I was in Europe, just before being called back to testify to the oversight committees of the CIA, which was 13th of May. I think I heard about it about the 10th when it appeared in the newspapers.
That was May of which year, General?
1973, sir.
Now, did you have an occasion in January of this year to prepare 2 memoranda to Mr. Ehrlichman on your contacts with Mr. Hunt?
I did, sir.
Now, I'd like to show you memoranda that are dated January 8th and January 10th, 1973, under the subject, Contact with Mr. Hunt, and I will pass these copies over to you. And I believe that the committee has already been provided with copies of these memoranda. General Cushman, are these the 2 memoranda that you prepared?
Yes, sir. They certainly look like copies of them.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask that these memoranda be submitted into the record at this time.
Without objection, so ordered.
Do these memoranda contain a summary of your experience with Mr. Hunt that you've just given us in testimony?
Yes, sir, they do.
Would you give us the circumstances that surrounded the preparation of these memoranda in your own words, please?
Yes, sir. I believe the date was the 13th of December, 1972. I was Commandant of the Marine Corps at the time, and Mr. Colby came to see me. He was then the number 3 man in CIA. He came to see me and stated that the agency had been directed to prepare a summation of their contacts with Howard Hunt. This had been directed, I gathered, by the Department of Justice, the prosecutors in the case. So he refreshed my memory on the phone call. I couldn't remember in December of 1972 who had telephoned me from the White House. I thought it was Mr. Ehrlichman, but I wasn't sure. When I had conversation on the 22nd of July with Howard Hunt, a number of names had been dropped in the conversation, Mr. Colson's, Mr. Ehrlichman's, maybe Mr. Dean, I don't know. In any event, I couldn't be very certain. I refreshed my memory from the transcribed conversation, and while Ehrlichman's name appeared in it, I didn't know whether this was sufficient for me to go putting it in writing or not. And the tape, of course, was the property of the agency, so I didn't know just where I stood on that. I then prepared the first memo, which is dated on the 8th of January. Wait, I have to go back a little bit. Apparently these papers were the subject later of conversation between Mr. Colby and the prosecutor, and I gather Mr. Ehrlichman, but I don't know. The next thing that happened, to my own knowledge, was along about the 7th or 8th of January this year. Mr. Colby called and said that Mr. Ehrlichman disputed the phone call incident, and would I prepare a memorandum stating, to the best of my recollection, what had happened. So I prepared the first memorandum, which I said Ehrlichman, Mr. Colson, or perhaps Mr. Dean. I simply cannot recall at this late date which one it is. of my own knowledge. I then got a call, as I remember it, from John Ehrlichman saying, look, I can't recall this phone call prior to the 22nd of July, and in fact, my records show I was out of town for a considerable length of time. Well, this shook up my recollection even worse, and so I offered, without being asked, I offered to take names out of it, since I didn't think it would be fair when I couldn't swear to it. And then I wrote the second memo in which I said that I couldn't recall who placed the call at this late date, but it was someone whom I recognized in the White House. The fact in the matter was that I hadn't combed through the minutes of the daily staff meetings. I had checked my own files in the office at CIA to see whether there was any record of this phone call, and I couldn't find one. However, in preparing the statement before the committees that Dr. Schlesinger had to make in May, he had a thorough search made of all possible documents and came up, I believe the secretary found them, came up with the minutes of the meeting of 8 July, in which I definitely stated that Mr. Ehrlichman had called. So based upon that, I swore out an affidavit, I believe it's the 13th of May, and used that affidavit before the CIA oversight committees, the three of them, before whom I had to testify.
General Cushman, so the record will be clear, I'd like to read the relevant portions from these two memoranda, a sentence or two from each. The January 8th memorandum states, I received a call over the White House line from either Mr. Ehrlichman, Mr. Colson, or perhaps Mr. Dean. Paren, I simply cannot recall at this late date just which one it was, Paren, stating that Mr. Hunt would call on me to ask for some support and that he was working on a matter for the person calling. Now, in the January 10 memorandum, this sentence appears. I cannot recall at this late date who placed the call, but it was someone with whom I was acquainted as opposed to a stranger. And the names of Mr. Ehrlichman, Mr. Colson, and Mr. Dean appear nowhere in the memorandum.
Correct.
Now, if I could ask you just a few questions on these two documents. First of all, since you reviewed the transcript of your conversation with Mr. Hunt on December 13th, and because in page 3 of that transcript it is stated that it was Mr. Ehrlichman who had called you, why did you have any real doubt that indeed it was Mr. Ehrlichman who had made the telephone call to you in July of 1971?
Well, my recollection was that it was Mr. Ehrlichman, but I was more concerned with putting it down on a piece of paper. I didn't know, as I say, that I could get a transcript of the tape. I didn't have this transcript. The agency had it and showed it to me. And the fact that it was a tape recording and that it belonged to the agency made me a little worried. I wanted something to corroborate it. Perhaps I was wrong on that, but that's the way I felt about it. And it wasn't until May of this year that we found what I considered to be corroborating entry in the records.
Now, after the January 8th memorandum was sent to the White House, did you also receive a call from Mr. Dean?
As I recall, I did get a call from Mr. Dean, which he said that we didn't know each other, and he was certain he hadn't talked to me. And I had to agree with him that we had not met, and that I couldn't explain why I'd put his name in, frankly. But his name was in the papers a lot, and Mr. Hunt, I think, may have mentioned him at some time during the conversation I had with him, but I'm not sure of that.
Well, I don't believe in the transcript that we have, which admittedly is a partial transcript because some of these sections are blocked out, were not typed. I don't believe in that transcript that Mr. Dean's name appears. Do you have any other explanation at this time why his name did appear in the January 8th memo?
No, I don't. Only what I've said.
Now, I believe you stated that you removed these three names from the memorandum voluntarily.
Yes, sir.
Is it your testimony that Mr. Ehrlichman put no pressure at all on you to have his name removed?
No, sir.
General Cushman, in your press conference that you had when you came back from Europe, you stated at page 19 that you tore up the first memo at Mr. Ehrlichman's request. And did Mr. Ehrlichman make a request to you that the first memo be torn up and that a second memorandum be substituted?
No, I would say that that is an inaccurate phrasing. He didn't ask me to tear it up. In fact, I guess he kept the original, as far as I know, but I tore up the copy and when I wrote the new memo on the 10th of January 1973. But he did not make a specific request that I tear it up.
So the statements you made in your press
It's not
conference
precise.
is inaccurate. My final question, I think this may be of some interest to the committee. If you tore up your copy of the memo, how did you produce for us last night the copy of the January 8th memo that we now have?
The secretary who took it when I dictated it over at the agency had retained her stenographic notebook.
Mr. Chairman, I have no more questions.
Mr. Thompson.
General Cushman, as I understand it, you reviewed the transcript of this conversation with Hunt on December the 13th, 1972.
Of this year.
Of this year?
I mean, of
last year?
1972, yes, sir.
Okay. Was that with Mr. Colby, who's now director?
Yes, Mr. William Colby.
And of course, Mr. Ehrlichman's name is mentioned in there as the person who had originally contacted you. And yet on January 8th of this year, when you write your memorandum, you say that it was either Ehrlichman, Colson, or perhaps Dean. Now, you say that Colson's name was mentioned, and I believe the transcript does bear this out. And of course, Ehrlichman's was. But I think Mr. Hamilton's right that Dean's name is not mentioned in the transcript. And I believe you said that Dean was also right when he told you that as far as he was concerned, you didn't know each other at all. Did anyone suggest to you that it might have been Dean? Did anyone suggest to you to put his name in?
No, sir. I have great difficulty in reconstructing my thought processes of putting the name in. And as best I can do is that it may have been mentioned by Hunt during our meeting, but was not in that part of the conversation which has come out in the transcript.
You keep referring to a partial transcript. Why is it partial?
I don't know, sir. This is what they gave me.
Is it partial in that not all of, in that it cuts off at some point in the conversation, or is it partial because there are excerpts from it where the tape cannot be?
I don't know whether the tape is unreadable or whether it was simply chit-chat. There are portions of the tape that are unreadable, I've been told, because of airplane noises and the like.
Do you recall who you talked to in the White House concerning this matter between December 13 and January 8 of 73, if anyone?
I don't recall talking to anybody in the White House until about the 8th. Mr. Colby called me and said that I should write out the memo. And then after I wrote the memo on the 8th of January, as I recall, then I got two phone calls, one from Mr. Dean and one from Mr. Ehrlichman, both protesting the use of their name in the memorandum, saying in one case that we hadn't talked and hadn't met each other. In the case of Mr. Dean, in the case of Mr. Ehrlichman, he said he was out of town, according to his records.
Assuming that Dean's name is not in the transcript, or assuming that his name did not come up in the conversation with Hunt at all, Do you have any idea where you might have gotten his name?
From the newspapers.
Or don't you think you would remember it if you talked to the counselor to the president?
Well, I probably should have if I'd talked to him, but I don't think I did.
No one suggested to you that his name should be included in the memorandum?
No, sir.
I have no further questions. Thank you, sir.
General, this visit from Hunt occurred on July the 22nd, 1971.
Yes, sir.
And did you receive a phone call or communication before you wrote the memorandum of February the 8th, 1973, what's been called the first memorandum, in which you stated...
Yes, sir. I was asked to prepare that 8 January 1973 memo for Mr. Ehrlichman by a phone call from Mr. William Colby.
Now, did you at that time receive information to the effect that Mr. Ehrlichman claimed that he was not in Washington on the 22nd of July 1971 when the phone call came from about Hunt's original visit?
Mr. Chairman, I think that was a call which came after Ehrlichman saw the memo I wrote on the 8th of January. He called me, as I remember it, saying my records show that I was out of town.
But now give me, again, if you don't mind, the name of the man that called you about that, whose call resulted in the writing of the memorandum of April the 8th, 1973, in which you stated the call may have come from Ehrlichman or Colson or Hunt, or Dean, I mean.
Yes, sir. That's Mr. William Colby called me.
Mr. William Colby.
Yes, sir.
Then after, then you prepared that memorandum of January the 8th, 1973, and sent a copy to the White House.
Sent the original, yes, sir.
Original. And after you had done that, you received a phone call from Mr. John Ehrlichman.
Yes, sir.
And Mr. John Ehrlichman stated in the phone call that he was not in Washington at the time the call was made to you for preparatory to Hunt's visit of July the 22nd, 1971.
Yes, sir. I would like to refresh the committee's memory, Mr. Chairman, that at the time I wrote the 8 January 1973 memo, I didn't have any recollection of what day it was that this phone call came. So I was quite shaken up when Mr. Ehrlichman said my records show I was out of town for a considerable period of time.
Yes. Did Mr. Ehrlichman ask you to prepare a second or substitute memorandum for the memorandum of the 8th of January, 1973?
Well, I told him that I couldn't recall well enough to swear to it as to his telephone call, and that I would rewrite the memo and take the name out of it.
Yes. And did you send him a copy of the
I sent the original of the second one. Yes, sir.
Now, when you were preparing for your testimony before the Oversight Committee of the CIA, there was a search made to find some record of who did call or make the call about Mr. Hunt's visit.
I think primarily all of the records were searched because Dr. Schlesinger had to testify, and he was newly appointed. And he didn't know anything about any of this and had to fine-tooth comb the records to make sure he had all the operative facts that he could testify to. And
that was in reference to the testimony of Dr. Schlesinger on his confirmation hearing. Is that right?
No, sir. He had to testify also as to what he knew about any connection between CIA and any of these affairs.
Yes. In other words, I was right in the first time that when I thought it was testimony before the CIA Oversight Committee.
Yes.
Now, at that time, one of the secretaries came up with a record which showed that the phone call had been initiated by Mr. Ehrlichman, did it not?
Yes, sir. If I'm not mistaken, Dr. Schlesinger so testified. And then, of course, I used it also.
Yes. Senator Baker.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. General Cushman, I may have missed a part of your testimony when I was out of the room.
trying to answer a roll call on the floor of the Senate. Did you describe to the committee how you came to tape the conversation with Mr. Hunt?
Yes, sir. When he came in the door, he said that he would like to have the meeting to be just between the two of us because it was highly classified and very sensitive. So I told my executive assistant to please remain outside the room, and I set the machine in motion.
Did Mr. Hunt know it was being taped?
No, sir. Not that I know of.
How did you set the machine in motion?
Simply push a button.
Is it a regular practice to record your conversations in your office?
It's possible to do so at all times, but I probably used that only about 6 times or so during 3 years.
Are those tapes available?
I don't know, sir. I assume that the agency still has them.
Could we have them? I noticed there are a number of omissions in here and references to plane noise and the like. If we wanted to, could the committee have those tapes?
I don't know, sir. I don't have any custody of them. I have to ask the CIA, I guess. They don't relate to this at all.
Well, the Hunt part does.
Oh, you mean the tape? I thought you were asking for the maybe half-dozen tapes that resulted from my conversations over a 3-year period.
No. I'm talking about the transcription of your meeting, or rather the tape of your meeting with Mr. Hunt on the 22nd of July, 1971.
Well, I imagine the council would ask the agency for it.
The only point is I'm trying to make is that you don't object if we have
sir.
access to that.
No, sir.
General Cushman, can you tell me anything beyond what's in this transcript, and I've now read the transcript of the conversation as carefully as I can you tell me, even though it may be somewhat repetitious, what material Mr. Hunt requested and what material or services that the agency supplied to him?
Well, the way it was set up was that he simply asked me for material that would provide him with an alias so that the person he was interviewing would not know who he was.
Did he tell you who that person would be?
He did not. He simply said it was a person, it was a highly sensitive one-time interview, and that the person was of an ideology which he wasn't sure of, and he didn't want to disclose his identity while he was interviewing the subject. And he said that this was a highly sensitive mission charged upon him by the White House to visit and elicit information from an individual.
What did you gain the impression that since he wanted disguised material that he wanted that the man might have known Mr. Hunt?
It could have been that, yes, sir. It entered my mind that this might be it. There was great concern at the time over security leaks, and he had been hired on as a consultant on security matters.
Did he ask for the voice alteration device for that purpose?
Well, listen, if I may come to this chronologically, I said okay, and based on this and the fact that he said this was in the national interest and so forth, and I had my executive assistant call the technical services people in the agency and say that Mr. Hunt would be levying a request upon them, and would they honor it. So this is the way it went from there on. I was not kept apprised on a daily basis of what he was getting. I found out after the event.
I understand from the document that's been handed to me by counsel that what was supplied was a Massachusetts driver's license. Let's see, this was back in September of 1960 when Mr. Hunt was working for the CIA, I assume.
Yes, so the first 2 items on that list are not germane to this issue. I don't believe they were issued 13 years ago or something.
And D.C. driver's license, also in 1960. Then in 1971, alias documents issued in the name of Edward Joseph Warren. I understand he specifically requested the alias Edward.
Yes, sir, I believe he did.
Did he explain why?
No, sir, he never requested any of these things from me.
Disguised materials, wig, glasses, speech alteration device. And then on about a month later, a tape recorder and a typewriter case and business cards in the name of Edward J. Warren. And then some 5 days later, a commercial Tessina camera disguised in a tobacco pouch, associate disguised, wig and glasses in the name of George F. Leonard, the documents to reflect that. Do you understand now that was Mr. Liddy?
That's what I've heard.
Yes. And the 27th, your facilities developed and returned film to a New York return film, and you were requested to provide a New York address and New York phone service, which you declined, and a credit card was requested and declined. Is that the sum total of the CIA support for Hunt and Liddy?
I can't answer that, sir. All I know is that that's the sum total of the technical services relationships with him.
Do you know of any other support or collaboration with Mr. Hunt or Mr. Liddy other than technical services?
Not of my own knowledge, but I did hear testimony before other committees to the effect that there was a psychiatric profile and some dealings concerning that, which I know nothing.
But you know of no other interrelationship between Hunt and Liddy and the CIA other than those that we've now covered?
No, sir, I don't. I might point out, too, sir, that if you notice the calendar that goes with those items, that everything up until just a few days before we called the White House and said no more, everything was consistent with the purposes of conducting an interview under an alias. Then when the request began to scale up to an office in New York, I think it was, and an answering service for his telephones, these things were not consistent in my mind with the purposes of a one-time interview, and also they would involve agency personnel, and that therefore, in discussing it with Mr. Helms, we agreed, and he told me to do so, call the White House and tell them we could not comply with the request.
General Cushman, do you know how many times the CIA has provided such technical or logistical support for any other arm or agency of the government for internal activities?
No, sir. There's been considerable, well, I guess it's a matter of controversy. They have assisted, I believe, other police, or I should say police departments by furnishing them with information on an invention of the agency, which, as I recall, assisted in determining whether a hand had held a gun and fired it, this sort of thing. I don't know of my own knowledge of this being done before. Of course, it could have. I was there a little less than 3 years. Might have happened some other times.
Did you know Mr. McCord personally?
No, sir.
You did know Mr. Hunt personally?
Yes, sir. Not well, but I knew him.
I noticed in the beginning of your conversation he speaks of the fact that you appear to have lost some weight. He says that he has too, and there's some other conversation of that type, which led me to believe
Yes,
that
sir.
you were acquainted.
He retired 1970. I think I went to his retirement ceremony and a party they had for him. I think that he recollects meeting me when I worked for Mr. Nixon in his capacity as vice president, because he had me monitoring the Bay of Pigs operation. In case he should have been elected, he wanted to know what was going on. And so I met a number of the people connected with that operation back in those days. I don't recall whether Hunt was in on this, and I met him at that time or not. He says so.
Just one or two more questions. Did you know Mr. Liddy?
No, sir.
Mr. Martinez?
No, sir.
Mr. Barker?
No,
Any
sir.
of those who were
No,
involved
sir, I
in the
didn't.
Watergate situation? We heard testimony from former Director Helms this morning, or I understood his testimony be that the material which was used here was not used in the Ellsberg break-in. Does that accord with your information and understanding?
I have no knowledge, sir.
You simply don't know. And you don't know what it was used for except for the statement of Mr. Hunt that it was for, I guess it would be fair to call it a covert interview, at least a concealed identity interview with some unnamed person.
Yes, sir.
And that's all you know about it.
it would not be so unusual to have that kind of an interview. For example, those who seek asylum in this country sometimes had to be interviewed, and the person of the interviewer had to be kept secret, so that this was not a new type thing for us, really.
And the reason I was asking you about whether you supplied any other facilities or services for Mr. Hunt was I noticed also in the transcript some reference to a safe house here in Washington.
Yes, sir. He did not, I had explained earlier, I believe while you were out, sir, that he did not want to return to the agency buildings because he was afraid he'd be spotted, I guess, by former associates. And therefore he requested that the technical services people meet with him somewhere off the premises, and we furnished him with that kind of a place.
That's what you were talking about in that part of the transcript, which reads, I wouldn't want to be seen walking out of here. I'm sure they've got safe facilities downtown.
Yes, sir.
General Cushman, yes, they sure as hell did on my last tour of duty here. Mr. Hunt, I remember FE dash. My private office is just at the stone's throw from the Roger Smith Hotel, and it was practically an FE division. They had so many spooks, parents, closed parents there, period.
Yes, sir.
That's what he was referring to.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Talmadge.
Chairman, the distinguished senator from Hawaii must take a plane shortly. I yield as much of my time as he may desire to the senator from Hawaii at this time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. General Cushman, we have spent much time today and in the weeks past discussing the break-in to the office of Dr. Ellsberg, psychiatrist. I believe we have testimony telling us how it was done and who were the participants and when it was done. I believe the most important question is why was it done, or the justification for this break-in. A few days ago, Mr. John Ehrlichman said that the justification was national security, and that these Pentagon papers had been given to some official in the Soviet embassy. New York Times on June the 16th began its publication of the Pentagon Papers. As Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency at that time, were you aware or did you have information indicating that copies of the Pentagon paper had been transmitted to some official in the Soviet Union prior to June the 16th, 1971?
Yes, sir. I don't know of my own knowledge, but it was so stated at one of our morning staff conferences, I believe.
Are you aware of who was responsible for this?
No, sir.
Articles have appeared quoting, quote, reliable sources, end quote, from the FBI, suggesting that they're not aware of any transmittal of copies of the Pentagon papers to the Soviet embassy. Was this matter discussed with the FBI?
I don't know, sir. I wasn't involved in that. We had quite a session with a small group of people, not including me, who read all the volumes to see what, as they were printed, of course, in the New York Times, everyone would be reading them. So they were read from the point of view of what intelligence sources, methods, and so on was going to be compromised and given away. As I recall, well, I don't know. These people reported to Mr. Helms. They didn't report to me, and I don't know just when it stopped, when they finished reading them, what they did with the conclusions, except that I imagine some kind of action may have had to been taken concerning certain intelligence sources and methods, perhaps, to stop using them if they had been compromised.
Since the activities of the Soviet Union, I presume, come within your jurisdiction, did you make any effort to investigate whether these Pentagon papers did, in fact, get into the hands of the Soviets?
No, sir, that was not part of my job.
Wasn't it considered important enough for an investigation?
Well, this was up to the director, sir, Mr. Helms.
Do you know whether the director made any effort towards this end?
Only that he put together this group of people, an ad hoc committee, if you will, to read the entire Pentagon papers, all the volumes, and see if there had been any compromise.
Well, I thank you very much, General Cushman. We have a vote at this time, so the committee will stand in recess subject to the call of the chair. Thank you very much.
As another vote interrupts the committee work, we're going to pause briefly. Public television's coverage of the Senate hearings will continue after another break for station identification.
Unabridged coverage of these hearings is provided as a public service by the member stations of PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service. From Washington, NPACT continues its coverage of hearings by the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. Here again, correspondent Robert McNeil.
Going back to the caucus room, Senator Talmadge is about to question General Cushman.
Committee will come to order. Senator Talmadge.
General Cushman, you've stated in your affidavit that you assisted Mr. Hunt because you were given instructions to do so by Mr. Ehrlichman. You assume that command came with the authority of the President of the United States, I take it, did you not?
He spoke with the authority of the name of the President because he was one of three chiefs of staff, Mr. Haldeman, Mr. Kissinger, and Mr. Ehrlichman. I consider that all three spoke with that authority. I've been trying to recall the exact words, which I'm not able to do, but it was something on the order of give him a hand or lend him a hand. There was no specific items requested or anything of that kind.
Now, you were the deputy director of the CIA, and Mr. Helms was the director.
Yes, sir.
Did you wonder why he called you and not Mr. Helms?
I think I was acting director on the day he called, but nevertheless, I had met Mr. Ehrlichman many years before, back in about 1960, I believe it was. It may have been that he had known me before. I don't know.
Did you think it was abnormal that the White House would request disguise for one of their own men to use for security purposes and not the Federal Bureau of Investigation?
It was unusual, yes, sir.
Did you wonder why they wanted to go to those unusual extremes?
No, this was left to Mr. Hunt to tell me what he was doing, which he did when he came on the 22nd of July and stated that on White House instructions that he was to conduct a one-time sensitive interview.
Now, your affidavit states that you finally advised Mr. Ehrlichman that the agency would not have anything further to do with Mr. Hunt. Isn't that rather forceful language to use when you had assumed that Mr. Ehrlichman was speaking with the authority of the President himself?
Well, sometimes you have to do that, sir.
You never did check out Mr. Hunt's authority with the President himself, did you?
No, sir.
Were you personally close to the President?
I don't consider myself close, but I've worked for him for 4 years when he was Vice President.
In what capacity, sir?
Sir?
In what capacity, sir?
I was his Assistant for National Security Affairs.
Thank you very much, General. I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Talmadge. Senator Gurney.
General, you did mention in your testimony that you knew Mr. Hunt before. Had you seen him for some time prior to his coming to get these
I've
materials?
been trying to recollect, sir. I think that I probably attended his retirement ceremony and the brief party they give old-time employees when they retire. This would be sometime, I think, in 1970 when I was deputy director. I probably may have known him back in the olden times. I did a tour in the Central Intelligence Agency in 1949 to 1951. I may well have run into him there, too. Probably did. It was a rather small outfit, just beginning then. Also, when I was working for Mr. Nixon in his capacity as vice president, when I was his assistant for national security affairs, I dealt with the liaison between his office and the CIA. And in particular, I monitored the progress of the Bay of Pigs planning. In case Mr. Nixon got elected president, he would then need to know all of the details of that operation.
Well, I was thinking more in terms of this time frame that we're speaking about now. I noticed in the transcript of the meeting between you and Mr. Hunt, there was a reference here to a phone number. I'll read the pertinent parts of the transcript. Mr. Hunt said, "I'll be talking to the same people in and out, and if it goes a little bit well, that's swell, and when there's something here that's illegible, I just won't exist. It's not possible this Friday." And your reply is, "Okay, let's see, you gave me a number one time where I could get you." What did you mean by that?
I believe he left with my secretary, as I reconstruct what I was talking about there, a number at the White House where he could be reached.
Well, was that when he came in this particular time?
No, sir, I think it was when he called the office to make the 22 July appointment, because it had not been firmed up in the phone call with Mr. Ehrlichman. It was simply left that he would come and see me at some time in the future. So he must have called my secretary to set up the date, as best I can reconstruct this.
And it was your secretary who had his phone number?
I believe so, yes, sir.
Had you been in touch with him on any other occasions?
No, sir.
In the time frame we're talking about?
No, sir.
He goes on to say, right, I guess he's talking about this number, Chuck Colson. My office is unattended so far, but that's a direct line to Colson's office, and my office is 2 floors up. And you say, all right, fine, whoever's there can get a hold of you. I presume Hunt is talking about this phone number that must have been Colson's number.
That's what I understood it to be, so that we could get in touch with him if we needed to.
Did you have any conversations or contact with Mr. Colson?
No, sir.
Just one other small inquiry here. This is a staff preparation of highlights of the staff's interview with you on August the 1st. And it has a item here, August 27, 1971. I'll just read what the staff said. This was in reply to Hunt's further demands. In response, Cushman called Ehrlichman and told him that Hunt had poor judgment and was becoming a pest, and Ehrlichman said he would restrain Hunt. I was just curious about why did you think he had poor judgment?
Well, he'd worked in the agency for, I guess, 20 years. And when he first came in to see me, he asked for the materials for a one-time interview. And up until, I think it was about August 20th, or thereabouts, his requests were pretty consistent with the purposes of conducting such an interview, except for the stenographer request. But then when he escalated to a request for an office and for a telephone answering service, this would involve CIA people, and while I still didn't sense anything sinister, it just seemed to me that he should know better than to ask for all these things. Frankly, I thought he was simply trying to cut down his expenses and this sort of thing.
In other words, it, in your mind, was poor judgment at these further requests that he
Yes,
was
sir.
far exceeding what he should and ought to know that.
Yes, sir. And of course, the thought entered my mind that he was obviously trying to get the agency to assist him further and further. And unless we really went to the mat to find out exactly what he was doing, I just felt that this was not wise. And the director agreed with me.
Did you think that he was doing this on his own, or did you think somebody was pushing him, perhaps?
Well, no, sir. He said he had a White House task to conduct an interview. And I didn't talk to him after that. And it was only when the technical services people began to wonder at these new demands the last 3, 4, 5 days there in August that they called up my office and said, we're beginning to get a little worried about these requests. Should we continue to fill these requests? And I talked to the director and said no. We called Mr. Ehrlichman and told him no.
While you were deputy director, had there been any other demands like this from the White House to assist in projects of this sort?
No, sir.
This is the only one.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, General. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Weicker. No question. No question. I have just one question. Is taking a camera, ordinarily, is that consistent with an interview?
It would be if he desired to take a picture surreptitiously of the person he was interviewing. Could be.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask a question in that respect? The camera and the tobacco pouch that was supplied him, supposedly consistent with his equipment to have a clandestine interview, was that the same camera in which the film was removed and developed showing the inside of Dr. Ellsberg's psychiatrist office?
I don't know, sir.
Was there any other camera or any other processing done?
No, sir. We processed, again, as I understand it, it wasn't to my knowledge until after the event, until this year sometime. He asked that a roll of film be picked up at the airport and developed for him. And this was done, and the pictures, I gather, were handed back to him.
But you don't know whether they were taken with this tobacco pouch camera or not?
No, sir, I don't.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, just one brief General Cushman, when you prepared the 8th of January memorandum for Mr. Ehrlichman, I might have been out of the room when you testified to this fact. Did you go back into your records, or more specifically, did you go to the tape recording and listen to it prior to responding to that memorandum?
No, sir.
I mean, prior to writing that memorandum?
No, sir. Mr. Colby came to my office and showed me what you, sir, have on the table in front of you. And I went through it, and in there it seemed to back me up that I thought it was Ehrlichman. I still wasn't all that sure about swearing to it when all that I had was a tape which was in the custody of the agency and a rather imperfect transcript which had been provided me by the agency in terms of a lot of airplane noise and this sort of business. I myself had not listened to the tape.
But in any event, I haven't read the whole transcript. The name Dean was nowhere in that transcript, was it?
It's not in the transcript, no, sir.
And so it was between the 8th of January, 73 and the 10th of January, 17 that you got the corroboration of the Secretary's minutes?
No, sir. I got 2 phone calls, one from Mr. Dean saying it couldn't have been me, and one from Mr. Ehrlichman saying I was out of town during this general period of the 22nd of July and previous. It was not until May of this year when all of the agency files were given a very thorough going over in order to prepare Dr. Schlesinger who had no knowledge of any of this, to prepare him for testimony before the CIA oversight committees. And of course I took advantage of their finding that to corroborate my previous guess that it had been Mr. Ehrlichman.
And I gather Mr. Ehrlichman said he was out of town. In other words, between the 8th of January 73 and the 10th of January 73, Mr. Ehrlichman said he was out of town, and Mr. Dean said it can't be me. And did you hear from Mr. Colson?
No, I never did.
So you just decided it was best not to put any names in the...
Yes, sir, I agreed. In fact, I made the offer that, well, I will take the names out, since I would not, based upon what I have, want to swear to it.
And you didn't feel that a tape recording was the best possible evidence of who the person was?
Well, I didn't know. It kind of shook me up when I was told that by Mr. Ehrlichman that he was out of town, too. I began to think I was perhaps what you see here in this transcript might have been just a suggestion. In other words, Mr. Hunt named Mr. Ehrlichman first, starting a sentence with his name,
right.
And then I say, yes, he called me. And I don't know, when I was told that this was impossible or almost impossible, I began to worry about it. None of us at that time knew when the phone call had been made. I couldn't recollect what day. Then in May, when I was called back from Europe to testify, I found that on the 8th of July, I had made the statement that the call had been made by Mr. Ehrlichman, and therefore it must have been on the 7th.
So there's no question in your mind now, as you appear before this committee, however,
Yes,
who made the call. Thank you very much.
Any further questions? The council has questions.
General Cushman, you are now very certain in your testimony that it was Mr. Ehrlichman who called you on July 7, 1971. At page 108 of your testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee on May 14th of this year, you indicated that maybe it had been Mr. Haldeman who had called you. Now, did Mr. Haldeman have any involvement at all with Mr. Hunt's relationship with the CIA in this matter?
No, sir, not with me, certainly.
Is there any reason that Mr. Haldeman's name was left out of that January 8th memorandum when you were speculating on the person who might have called you?
No. I just didn't think that he had called, and I thought the others might have made the call.
Now, you said, I believe, in response to a question that I asked you, that you were not sure if Mr. Hunt had said when he escalated his request to the agency that he had a new assignment. I'd like to show you a memorandum that is dated August 26, 1971. I believe the date has been obscured by the Xeroxing process. And the subject of this memorandum is TSD request for guidance on extent of assistance to Mr. Hunt. Now, you will notice that in the copy that I have given you, there are certain blanks. We have excluded certain names so we won't compromise anyone at the agency whose name should not be revealed. I call your attention to paragraph 3, and there's a sentence in there that reads, according to Mr. Hunt, he said that he needed the camera in connection with a new assignment being in quotes. Does that refresh your recollection as to whether...
Yes, this is what I couldn't put my finger on yesterday. That's correct.
Do you recall if anyone in the agency inquired as to what this new assignment was that Mr. Hunt had been given?
No, sir.
General Cushman, you testified that in December 1972, Mr. Colby came to you and asked you to prepare a memo on your relationship with Mr. Hunt. Do you know who had asked Mr. Colby to make this request of you?
No, sir, I don't, except that I understand it was the prosecutor in the Justice Department.
Well, if it was the prosecutor, why was the memorandum addressed to Mr. Ehrlichman and sent to Mr. Ehrlichman?
Because I provided, first of all, to Mr. Colby verbally that I thought I'd recollected the phone call. And I gather that they wrote it up, some sort of a synopsis of all of the dealings of the agency with Mr. Hunt. And that this, I gather, was on the subject of conversation between Mr. Colby and the prosecutor and I guess Mr. Ehrlichman, because I then received a call in January from Mr. Colby saying that Mr. Ehrlichman did not recollect this telephone call whatsoever, and that he didn't think he was even in town at the time, and therefore would I put the facts down on a piece of paper and send it to Mr. Ehrlichman. So I said, okay, and I did that.
And finally, General Cushman, I'd like to clarify for the record your statements on this psychiatric profile of Daniel Ellsberg that was provided by the CIA. I take it that at some time you learned that such a profile had been prepared.
In May of 1973.
And I take it from your testimony and from that answer that you had nothing to do with the preparation of this profile.
Yes, sir, that is correct.
Now, is it the normal course, from your knowledge and experience, for the CIA to prepare a profile on an American citizen?
No, sir. It would be unusual.
Can you think of another instance where this has been done that can be revealed?
Well, my accounting would not be exhaustive, of course, but during the 3 years I was there, I don't recall any other being made on an American.
And I take it that this procedure is usually reserved for foreign leaders.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions.
Without objection, I'll put in the record the memorandum of January the 8th, 1973, the memorandum of January the 10th, 1973, and the document dated August 27th, 1971, and the one of August 1973, the memorandum for the records entitled Mark those appropriate as
Mr. Chairman, you might also, just so we have the whole caboodle in the record, put in the transcript of the tape-recorded conversation between Mr. Hunt and General Cushman dated July 22nd, 1971.
Yes, that'll be marked as appropriate as an exhibit and put in the record as such. General, on behalf of the committee, I want to thank you for your appearance here and for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Before the General leaves, did you place in the record, Mr. Chairman, the memorandum of August 1971?
I just did that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, General.
Now, the White House furnished us 3 documents, and Senator Baker and I submitted to Mr. George F. Murphy, Deputy Director of the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, who is an expert in intelligence matters, with a request that these documents be sanitized so as to remove all references to foreign intelligence, and that has been done. And Senator Baker and I have both inspected the documents, and without objection, they will put in the record at this point. My understanding is the staff will not be ready on General Walters till in the morning, and for that reason, the committee will stand in recess till 9:30 tomorrow morning.
Okay.
The committee's probe has entered a new phase, with the senators seeking to fill in the blanks left in the story set forth by the principals in the case. It was a short day and one generally devoid of drama, but there was added detail. We had Marine Corps Commandant Robert Cushman say he remembered John Ehrlichman calling him to ask for aid to E. Howard Hunt, even if Ehrlichman couldn't recall the conversation. The parade of spies continues tomorrow as the committee tries to pin down the role of the CIA in the Watergate cover-up and in pre-Watergate aid to the plumbers.
Today we got to see our first official U.S. government spies, for unlike freelancers Bernard L. Barker and Tony Ulasewicz and others, Richard Helms and Robert Cushman were both 100% legitimate. Jack Murphy, professor of law at the Georgetown University Law Center here in Washington, and John Lofton, who is about to become a syndicated newspaper columnist after 3 years editing Monday and First Monday official publications, the Republican National Committee, were back with us today, and they watched these two former officials of the CIA in action. First to you, Jack. What, from an evidence point of view, what do you think we learned today?
Well, I think the critical and intriguing thing that developed in today's hearings, at least for me, is the developing split on the committee as to what to make of the administration's approach to the CIA scant days after the June 17th break-in. Today you had, in the case of both testimony by Mr. Helms and by General Cushman, a bias, I thought, evidenced on opposite sides of the aisle as to what impression should be left as to why the approach was made to Mr. Helms and to General Walters on June 23rd. The Republicans seem to be saying, isn't it proper to view this approach in which the CIA, it was suggested, would go to Gray and limit the investigation as simply a logical reaction to an inquiry in their minds that the CIA might have been involved in this and that CIA operations might be compromised. A logical inquiry because, after all, Hunt had been a CIA agent. There are a number of other CIA agents, former employees of CIA involved in the break-in, and wouldn't it be sensible to look at all that evidence and say the CIA is possibly involved? The other side of the aisle is trying to say this is very suspect that you would go to the CIA in this fashion so soon after the break-in and make the kinds of statements to Walters and Helms which on contradictory evidence have been made. And they're saying, in fact, what has happened here is not a logical approach because, after all, Hunt, the key contact, was a White House employee. He was hired by Ehrlichman for the plumbers unit. And this was, in effect, emphasized by Cushman's testimony that on August 27th of 1971, following Hunt's persistent efforts to get more materials and assistance from the CIA, Cushman called up Ehrlichman and told him to call Hunt off. He was becoming a pest, exercising bad judgment, and so on. So Ehrlichman knew back in 71 clearly that Hunt was no CIA operative.
Jack, even though it's being done, as you say, or it may be being done for partisan reasons, don't you consider this, from the standpoint of everybody watching this, a healthy thing, though, in terms that both theories have advocates and they get a full test?
Oh, certainly.
You can take your choice?
Absolutely, no question. In my own position, as somebody sitting here like you weighing the evidence, however, I'm coming out strongly against the notion that there was anything logical or necessary in going to the CIA at the time in which they did, and in the manner in which they did. Of course, in that latter respect, we're looking forward to General Walters' testimony to clarify what was often a fuzzy picture of precisely what was said on June 23rd in Mr. Helms' testimony this morning.
How do you feel about it, John Lofton?
I think that for John Dean, that Richard Helms' testimony was just one more person challenging Dean's testimony. Dean, in his testimony, said that John Dean's request to General Walters for CIA salaries and bail money for the Watergate burglars was at the request of John Ehrlichman. Dean indicated he was not enthusiastic about the proposal and that he agreed with General Walters that it was inappropriate. However, in relating General Walters' testimony, Mr. Helms indicated that John Dean was very enthusiastic about the idea and seemed to be asking if the agency could in fact do it rather than just seeing if it would be proper. So I think it's going to be interesting what General Walters says about that. As a witness, to go over to General Cushman, I thought he was rather flaky, and I didn't think he was too credible a witness. He refuted himself twice, at least twice, once when he said that the original Ehrlichman request to see Howard Hunt was an extraordinary request, and then today he retracted that word extraordinary, saying that that wasn't exactly the right word and he didn't mean to use it. Again, contradicting himself, General Cushman said that Mr. Ehrlichman had asked him to tear up a memo, and then he said that that wasn't exactly right, that he had used imprecise phrasing was the word he used. Again, when it came to John Dean's name being mentioned in a memo which General Cushman had written, he said that although he had not talked to John Dean, he put his name in the memo because his name happened to be in the news at the time. So I don't think he was very believable.
Yes, but from a would you not agree at one thing, though, that on there are many issues involved, but a key issue as to who called him and said, help out E. Howard Hunt, that did it come over to you conclusive that there's no longer an issue, at least as far as he's concerned, that it was in fact John Ehrlichman who made the call?
Yes, I think definitely so. I was going to add something, too, that General Cushman said in passing that he knew that John Ehrlichman was in charge of security within the White House domestic security area, and of course Mr. Helms denied that he knew anything about the plumbers, and I'm sorry that the committee didn't ask General Cushman if he knew about the plumber's operation.
Yeah. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Ever since these hearings began, people have been comparing them with commercial entertainment. And last night, art followed life as Dick Cavett taped a television show in the caucus room with some of the senators. Impact's Peter Kay talked with Cavett after today's session and asked whether he wasn't becoming bored with the longest-running show in town.
Have you been watching these hearings right along?
I'm kind of a Watergate junkie. I found that I not only watch them, but that night I watch the same thing again. And I wake up in the middle of the night wishing there were some more on after it's all over. They're not only fascinating, but they're interesting to go to sleep to. You can kind of drift into a state of subconsciously hearing them, then semi-consciously. First semi, then sub, and then you're out.
Have you got any particular heroes or villains in this 8-week drama?
No, not really. I think probably the hero, the man who's the most overlooked, is the one who first found that piece of masking tape.
The guard.
And no one knows that man's name. I bet there isn't one person in a million who could.
How about Frank Willis?
That sounds like it. Is that it?
That's
well,
it.
You win. Do you know, I was wondering, though, how many people in America do you think, if you stopped them on the street, could name the 7 members of the committee?
Well, I don't know. I saw a Harris poll today, which was evaluating, perhaps a poll mentioned it, and most of the people had an opinion about everybody on the committee. Now, they might have been faking it, but they seemed to know who they were.
Well, because there are people who are telling us, listen, nobody's watching this except a few people in New York and Washington. The rest of the country is snoring away and doesn't care. But I don't get the impression that that's true at all. And yet an awful lot of people say that. And every so often you run into somebody, a doctor or a professional man who says, oh, I stopped following that some weeks ago. I couldn't tell you who's up to the witness now. It's wondered.
Let me ask you a question. Do your ratings show that people are watching the Watergate hearings?
Yeah, that's interesting. I had someone check into that. Someone came up with the theory that of the late night shows, mine suffers the most from the Watergate hearings because people who would tend to watch me are also watching them. So that'll give them an interesting conflict on Tuesday when I have 4 members of the committee on my show while they're actually opposite themselves, assuming the hearing runs that long on the replay.
Well, maybe some of the people who are watching tonight will get the hint and can switch back and forth next Tuesday. Dick, thanks very much.
Don't say tonight. That's the name of another show.
There have been a number of indications recently that President Nixon has begun something of a counterattack on the Watergate Committee. There were well-founded reports last week that the president was angry at the committee, which he felt was out to get him. When he got out of the hospital after being treated for viral pneumonia, Mr. Nixon scorned people who wallow in Watergate. Night before last, he slipped into a speech honoring Japanese Premier Tanaka, remarks which are assumed to refer to the hearings. He said, let others spend their time dealing with the murky, small, unimportant, vicious little things. We've spent our time and will spend our time building a better world. It's not certain what Mr. Nixon's intention is, but if it is, as some have suggested, to turn public opinion against the hearings themselves, he's going to have a tough job. That national poll taken by the Harris Organization, which Peter just referred to, published today, says that 62% of the American people give the Senate committee a positive rating. Interestingly, the positive rating for the committee's work rises to 73% among business executives. The chairman, Senator Ervin, gets a favorable rating from 62% of Americans for his handling of witnesses, followed by Republican Vice Chairman Howard Baker with 57%. The figures do not show that the American people like wallowing in Watergate. The figures are not a measurement of how the public weighs the evidence so far as exonerating or incriminating to the administration. But the popularity of the committee suggests that trying to discredit it or turn the American people against it might be an impossible public relations task, in view of the fact that Mr. Nixon's own approval rating, according to the latest national poll, has sunk into the low 40s. We'll be back tomorrow night. I'm Robert McNeil. For my colleagues Peter Kay and Jim Lehrer, good night for Impact.
From Washington, you've been watching gavel-to-gavel videotape coverage of hearings by the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. This coverage is made possible by grants for special events coverage from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Ford Foundation, and has been a production of Impact, a division of the Greater Washington Educational Telecommunications Association.